Welcome back to the official Madam Web podcast.
Oh, God. The number of times we've seen that trailer.
It's such a joy.
I really can't wait to watch that movie. I think it's going to be such a ride.
I love Dakota Johnson.
I'll follow her no matter what she does.
Exactly.
Including a Marvel movie about time travel.
After the trailer, I leaned over to you and said the things I do for love.
What a good transition.
Thank you.
All right, so we're talking about Game of Thrones.
Yes, this Game of Thrones book discussion is brought to you by our Patreon. Briefest little plug, we have 2 bonus episodes for you this month. One dropped last Sunday, I believe, and that was us talking about Godzilla -1 - Color. Fantastic revisiting that movie in a whole new way. Our big episode for the month just dropped this past Tuesday, and that was Volume 5 of The Breakfast Buffet. That's us talking about some recent movies. It's a roundup. It's, I think, 4 movies.
4, yeah.
It's a full hour discussion. It's All of Us Strangers.
The Zone of Interest.
The Beekeeper.
The Beekeeper. And then there's one more that's also
Anyone
fun.
But You.
Anyone But You. That's right.
Yes.
There were like 2 downers and 2 uppers. So
Huge variety. The theme this week is difficult topics that we're discussing on the pod.
For real.
But this chapter, today's discussion, is Game of Thrones, Daenerys, Chapter 2.
Yes. Let me give us all a brief recap of what happens in this chapter, and then we can have a nice discussion. So this is only our second time with Dany, even though we're about, I think, 10 or 12, something like that, chapters in. And we spent some time talking last week about sort of how these Dany chapters are, like, where they're placed in the larger context of the whole book. So I'm excited to keep tracking that. We talked about how this sort of like demarcates or signifies a sort of different section, different chapter, if you will, of the book. So
Targaryen Checkpoints.
We
will return to that later. That was a great catch.
Did you just now name that Targaryen Checkpoints?
I did that in my notes earlier.
Oh, well, that's fantastic. Well done. You could have just said yes. I would have believed you. Nobody would know. Okay, so it is the day before Daenerys and Khal Drogo's wedding. Drogo has accepted the deal that they wanted to form, where they were like, hey, if if we offer you Daenerys as your bride, will you help Viserys reclaim the throne, or the Iron Throne in Westeros? And Drogo has said yes. And he has promised Viserys a crown. But Illyrio does remind Viserys that it may take some time. He says that, the Dothraki keep their word, but they do it in their own time. Viserys is predictably impatient because he has the temperament of a child. Dany is, of course, terrified of what's going to happen the next day. The night before the wedding, she has this dream of a dragon. Basically, in the dream, Viserys is hurting her, and then he disappears, and a dragon appears and is surrounded by columns of fire. I will talk a lot more about this dream later. We're all surprised. So then the next day happens, and the wedding lasts all day. Dany is basically seated next to Drogo, kind of at the head of everything, and she is completely terrified and totally alone. Drogo doesn't speak any of her language as far as she knows, and he just doesn't really talk to or look at her. Viserys is sort of seated below her, and he is furious about this. He's just like seething the whole day. But during the day, there's basically like feasting, drinking, dancing. There's also like open copulating and fighting, and like 12 men are killed, and that's like very normal. And like Illyrio says, if at least 3 men aren't killed, it's like a boring wedding, basically. So that's happening all day, and Dany's just like not eating and is just, stewing in fear. Near the end of the celebrations, the gifts are presented to the bride. So Jorah has given Dany some books. They are songs and histories of the 7 kingdoms. She is so touched by this gift and loves it. Viserys gives Dany 3 handmaids, which he didn't even have to pay for. Illyrio paid for. Illyrio gives her 3 dragon eggs, which have been turned to stone. We know these are, of course, the dragon eggs, but to Dany, they just seem like these beautiful artifacts, basically. They're from the Shadowlands far away, and they're green, red, and green, white, and black, and they just look like giant stone crystals, and they're gorgeous. Drogo gives Dany a beautiful silver horse that she is actually very pleased to have received. So after the gifts are given, the wedding ends, and Drogo and Dany ride away from the celebration to go consummate their marriage. On the way, Dany is completely terrified. She keeps like saying to herself over and over, I am the blood of the dragon. I'm the blood of the dragon, like just trying to get through this whole thing. Because remember, Drogo is terrifying to her, Viserys is terrifying to her, the Dothraki people, like she's afraid of everything because this is all, not what she wants to do. It's all very foreign to her, and she's 13, and everybody is like older and bigger and scarier than she is.
And looking to her with expectation.
Yes, right.
It's overwhelming.
Yeah, it's incredibly overwhelming. So they stop at a riverbank, and they like get off their horses. And the rest of this scene, Drogo is, to Dany's surprise, actually quite slow and gentle. She starts out very, very terrified. And even though they don't speak the same language, like they can't really communicate, she can kind of get the sense that Drogo is getting the sense that she is afraid. And it turns out he does know one word of the common tongue, which is basically English for us. And that's the word no. And so he sort of uses that as a way to like check in with her, sort of like get her permission for things and sort of move forward in that way. And so as it's going on, he basically is doing what he can to make the whole thing easier and more pleasant for her. And it's an unexpected thing for her, which is like a bit of a relief. And like the chapter sort of ends with her sort of accepting what's happening and almost taking control. Because like at the very end he says no as a question, and then she says yes. Right. So it's a really like challenging scene. But I think Cam and I sort of talked about this off pod, in that in the context of this world that they're in, the culture that Drogo is coming from, the arranged nature of their marriage, and sort of the duty that comes along with all of it, it is actually surprisingly not horrible. Like for our modern sensibilities, this is of course a really horrifying scene, especially because she's 13 years old. Right. But the way that it's handled it is a surprise to Dany, and it is not as, you know, scary and terrible as she thinks it's going to be, especially because at the wedding she had seen like these Dothraki men just like not even like just taking women in like this really like she describes it as an animalistic way, and that's like
nothing consensual.
That's what she's expecting from Drogo, and that's not what happens at all.
Right.
So it's a surprise to her.
It's difficult in how relative it is.
Yeah.
You have to. There are like 3 or 4 contextual veils hanging over this scene that are difficult to sort of layer into a discussion. But yeah, I agree with the way you laid it out there.
Okay.
Maybe one interesting sort of a smaller thing to start with. I'm glad you hit this in the recap, because it really stuck out to me when I was just paging through this chapter after I finished reading it. The dragon, maybe this is me missing something from the lore. Are the dragons alive in these eggs, or are these old dead historical relics? Like, does she awaken them and sort of revitalize them with some sort of magical whatever later?
Yeah.
Or do they have some latent, like, are they almost hibernating?
Sure. That's a really great question that I've never really thought about. I kind of think they are stone here. She describes them as really heavy. I mean, a dragon egg wouldn't be light, but I don't think they would be, you know, eggshells are light and like, you know, I don't know. I also think it would be strange that like dragon, you know, zygotes could have survived thousands and thousands of years. So I think they are stone, and then whatever magic, I don't remember the details very well, but whatever magic happens at the end with Khal Drogo and the witch doctor lady and the fire stuff, like I think that is what, and combined with Dany's own personal magic, I think that is what turns the eggs from stone into actual like dragons. I
agree, but I think that process, that transformation, starts in this chapter. I think it's sort of like in Harry Potter, how Harry can pull the sword of Gryffindor out of the sorting hat because he's like a true and worthy Gryffindor. I think only sort of a true and worthy Targaryen could revitalize these eggs.
Sure.
But the introduction of these, I mean, it happened so quick. This chapter moves incredibly. It's so light on its feet. It's like 9 pages.
There's a lot of like really important things that happen that don't necessarily, you don't clock as all that important first time reading it, but reading this you're like, oh, there's so much important stuff in here.
And so much happens. And you get to the dragons really quickly. And I'm reading them as already sort of alive just by coming into contact with Dany.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Because the way it hit me, this felt like, and I guess we could debate this if you have a different conclusion, but this felt like the first moment of magic in the book since we saw the White Walkers in the prologue.
Not even like the moment in the first Dany chapter where she goes into the hot bath and it doesn't burn her?
I think that's another sort of hint, but this is a big magical dragon egg. That's, you know, that's more magical to me. Yeah. That feels more prophetic and consequential than, you know, she has a higher tolerance for hot water.
Yeah, sure. I was going to say,
she's
any girl can get into a hot bath and she'll be great.
That's incredibly true.
Yeah.
And I think maybe the way of reading this, because we haven't dealt that much with magic. We have things that feel supernatural.
Yeah.
We know the White Walkers are kind of zombies. We know Bran's got something going on with animals,
Sure.
right? And those animal prophecies.
And like the dire wolves themselves kind of have this magical quality, but
I
it's all
guess.
kind of like background subtle.
They're
you know?
also just big huskies, you know? Like they
Sure.
have some ties to their
And-
owner. I mean, it's like a
and they-
Pokemon thing.
They just
kind
seem like extra smart dogs.
they're very connected to their Pokemon trainers, yes. But it's not magic in the same way that White Walkers were.
Yeah,
This
sure.
felt like a return to that level of magic.
Okay.
But we haven't dealt with, and I'm using sort of a game terminology here, we haven't dealt with like magic wielders.
Yeah, no, we
You know,
haven't.
we
There's
haven't
been
dealt
no mages, no sorcerers, no wizards, nothing like that.
But when I was going back through this chapter, that phrase that you highlighted in the recap kept sticking out to me on the page when Dany repeats, "I am the blood of the dragon."
Yeah.
And it reminded me, again, I don't know why Harry Potter was in my head for this chapter, but when Harry is, and when he has the sorting hat on, and he keeps saying, "Not Slytherin."
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And it almost felt like the dragons were awakened by this repeated spell, where Dany is invoking her heritage, her lineage, which is so important to the symbol of her house coming back to life in the same way that, I mean, I'll get to that later, but in the same way the direwolves came back with some worthy Starks. Now the dragons are coming back, but it felt like she was coaxing or conjuring these dragons back into existence.
That's really, really interesting. I like that you said that, and I like the way that you've talked about the idea that the dragons sort of come alive in this chapter. And that totally tracks with something I was paying attention to here. I was looking at sort of these ideas of courage and fear. Like the whole running thread through this chapter is how afraid Dany is and how she has to face this terrifying reality, right? And, you know, like we're reminded in this chapter that so many times that Dany is a child. She is 13 years old. There are so many moments where she says like she felt like a child. Khal Drogo lifts her up as if she were no bigger than a child, like lots of stuff like that. But over the course of the chapter, she has to sort of come to grips with like again, facing her fear. Because, you know, she's only 13, but she's facing these really adult challenges. And this like way that she repeats the phrase, "I am the blood of the dragon," is like a way for her to sort of conjure courage. But what's interesting is that it sort of like shifts over the course of the chapter, because at first she's saying to herself, "I am the blood of the dragon does not fear." And that view of courage, I think, is a very childlike way to view courage. A lot of kids, like even like, I think Bran deals with this. They look at their parents and think, my dad is never afraid of anything. And then you become an adult and realize, no, my dad is afraid and he faces things anyway in spite of his fear. And that's what makes him courageous. And Dany sort of has to figure that out over the course of this chapter. Because at the end of the chapter when she's with Drogo, we get this brief moment before the end with her horse. Like before she gets to the end, she's with the horse. And the narration says, "And for the first time in hours, she forgot to be afraid. Or perhaps it was the first time ever." And that is, again, like an absence of fear. That's a childlike view of what courage is. She has this great moment where she's on the horse. But the second that she gets back and she has to like face Viserys, like he says something awful to her, that moment of like what she thinks of as bravery goes away. And it says, "She felt like a child once more, only 13 and all alone, not ready for what was about to happen to her." And I was struck by that "happen to her," which feels very passive. Like for most of the chapter, she is afraid of what is going to happen to her. She feels like she has no control or agency. But in this moment with Drogo, when they get to the riverbank, over the course of that scene, she sort of finds her agency, and that's what gives her courage. Because at the end of the chapter, she controls Drogo's hand and she takes charge. He says no, and then she says yes, and like brings his hand to her. And so over the course of this chapter, that like repeating the phrase, "I am the blood of the dragon," that like just that sense of courage is awakening in her, and she's overcoming her childlike view of what it means to be brave, and is like sort of claiming some agency in the situation. So I think that tracks perfectly with the dragon eggs. I really like that.
I think I love that you picked up on that, because I just was flashing through all of these scenes from the show, just because that's the easier sort of shorthand version of seeing her entire arc. And her entire story is these constant, pun intended, trial by fire scenarios where she wins by taking control, by asserting herself and her agency. And this very much felt like another distillation echo of the age discussion that we had last week in terms of Jon talking to Robb and them trying to act in their father's stead and take care of the family. And there's obviously, that's much harsher here. Yeah. That's much more visible here. I think that's the sort of the trend with these distillation echoes. It's more heartbreaking. It's more obvious that tragic coexistence between youth and adulthood is so much more overt and brutal in this chapter that I think it sort of explodes and resolves that idea that was played with in the last chapter. But again, I'm struck by the way George writes these tragedies because everything does feel like it is from Dany's perspective and serving her character development. There is such respect and vulnerability and strength and resilience because so much of her arc is horrible situations being thrust upon her, and the enduring trait for this character is her resilience. And I love that we've only spent 10 pages, 15 pages in her company so far in this book, and she's already the most resilient person here.
Right, yeah.
I was just impressed by, again, how many plates he can spin at one time.
Definitely.
To go back to that Targaryen checkpoint thing that we talked about earlier, I'm trying to look at this book as a series of different kind of little books strapped together with the Targaryen checkpoints, the Dany chapters, breaking up those sequences. But I guess the question to you, now that we've read this chapter, because you started that Targaryen checkpoint theory last week before we'd done this chapter, now that we've gone through these pages, do you think this Dany chapter is the end of the first sequence in this book or the beginning of the second?
I think it is the beginning of the second, because this is a real turning point for Dany over the course of this chapter. Like, her whole life changes because she is married to Khal Drogo, and she is sort of quickly having to become an adult in a way that she did not have to before. I mean, she was never a normal child. She's never had a normal childhood or life. She's always had to face, pretty harsh realities, especially with Viserys as her brother. But this is a real turning point, especially like her getting her dragon eggs and her sort of getting to know Khal Drogo in this new way. Yeah, I think it's the start of a new thing and not the end of an old thing. What do you think?
Yeah, maybe it's sort of cheating, but I think it's a little of both. I think there's some past and some future. I'm almost, and this is a working theory because we're not that far into the book, but this almost feels like a graduation where we have some echoes of previous chapters being paid off. I think the conversations we had in the last few weeks about that limbo state, I think that is Dany's entire subconscious, her entire, even her active waking mind through this chapter until the very last paragraph. I think she's embodying that limbo state. Yeah. But yes, I also think it's full of hints towards the future. Oh, so it acts as this transition and acknowledgement. It felt like more of, I thought it was going to feel more like a bookend, and it feels more like a centerpiece.
Okay. Yeah. I know what you mean.
It's a bridge.
There are certainly big moments of like prophetic foreshadowing. I tracked really like two main ones. I don't know about you. Do you want to talk about her dream?
Yeah. This is like a death and prophecy thing, right?
Yeah.
Because my immediate thing was, well, people are murdered throughout the chapter. And of course, there's prophecy throughout the chapter. It starts with Viserys sort of dumping on all the omens that the Khal and the Khalasar respect and wait for within the wedding ceremony. But obviously you also have the omens and prophetic introductions of dragon eggs and even Dany's new future, to talk about that like meat and potatoes prophecy we've been playing with. Yeah. So yes, on a surface level, there's a lot of death and prophecy, but I leave things like dreams to you.
Great. Okay. Well, I wanna, if it's okay, I'm gonna like actually just read her dream to everybody so we can get it real quick. It's not that long. So it says, let's see. Oh, because sorry, right before the dream starts, Dany is thinking about dragons because, Viserys keeps saying over and over, the lady doth protest too much. He's like, I'm the dragon, right? And Dany thinks to herself, there are no more dragons. And then it says, yet that night she dreamt of one, Viserys was hitting her, hurting her. She was naked, clumsy with fear. She ran from him, but her body seemed thick and ungainly. He struck her again. She stumbled and fell. You woke the dragon, he screamed as he kicked her. You woke the dragon, you woke the dragon. Her thighs were slick with blood. She closed her eyes and whimpered. And as if in answer, there was a hideous ripping sound and the crackling of some great fire. When she looked again, Viserys was gone. Great columns of flame rose all around, and in the midst of them was the dragon. It turned its great head slowly. When its molten eyes found hers, she woke, shaking and covered with a fine sheen of sweat. She had never been so afraid. I think you can read this dream as being about what she is afraid is going to happen the next day, in the way that a lot of our dreams reflect our fears. And I think it's also a dream about what's going to happen at the end of this book. Spoiler. So a couple of things I want to point out. The line, her thighs were slick with blood. I think you can read that as she is afraid of what's going to happen on her wedding night. She's afraid of that brutality and that, thing that all girls are afraid of. But then you can also connect it to her birth going wrong at the end of the book when she miscarries her unborn son, and then when the dragon eggs are eventually, when the dragons are eventually born. There's also the line, of course, that says Viserys was gone, which makes us think about
thank God
Viserys' eventual death, which is going to come pretty soon, I think.
Yeah.
But also, in her marrying Khal Drogo, I think she's maybe hoping that she will be able to get away a bit from Viserys. And then the line, great columns of flame rose all around. I think we can think of that mostly as the fire at the end when she is sort of reborn from the flames and all of that. And then I also like, in the midst of them was the dragon. When its molten eyes found hers, she woke. And I was struck by the fact that there's only one dragon in this dream instead of 3. So I don't think it's meant to be about her 3 dragons who she eventually has. I think it's really meant to be her. I think because she starts the chapter really afraid, right? And it even says, like, she has no agency at the beginning of not the chapter, the dream. She has no agency at the beginning of the dream. It says her body seemed thick and ungainly. But then, of course, the dragon emerges and moves its great head. So I think this dream is also tracking that journey of sort of becoming an adult, of graduating, and of like claiming her agency and her courage over the course of the next day that's about to happen. And of course, what's going to happen to her in the grander scheme. So it's sort of like short term and long term. I found that to be really interesting to break down.
It's very interesting. Yeah, I didn't get half of that out of that. So this is why it's fun to do this together.
Dreams are so fun to look at. And often it's very possible I'm reading very heavily into it, but I'm also, why the hell would he not put this dream? Why would he put this dream in there if it didn't mean something?
Dreams, visions, prophecies. We're supposed to read deeply into those things.
Sure.
I don't know if there's any other reason to include them in a story.
Yeah, exactly.
Unless you're doing that sort of Matador invitation for us to play with some ideas and images.
Yeah.
I caught a couple unexpected little echoes. They're not on that level, maybe, but interesting and unexpected. I caught some parallels between Dany and some of our other POV characters, if you want to play with that for a minute.
Sure.
The first one is, and I'm glad you did the recap so deliberately, because there's a very specific, difficult to capture tone in the way the wedding night is written. But it did feel very different than how I remembered or expected it to.
Yeah.
In that it did feel more like a political arranged marriage, where 2 geopolitical forces create some sort of deal and marry off, whatever the next generation is, to secure some end, some military end or guarantee.
Right.
That's what this felt like. And unexpectedly, I was reminded of Ned and Catelyn's relationship. And them discussing their sort of arranged marriage, and that they came to love each other, and the arc of their unexpected relationship.
Yeah, because like Catelyn was supposed to marry Ned's brother, but then he died a couple weeks before their wedding. So I was like, okay, Ned instead, wasn't what any of them wanted or planned on, but they made it work. Yeah,
and there's death hanging over this marriage as well. I mean, literally as part of the ceremony
at the wedding. Yeah,
but the ceremony, the reluctance, and the strange arc of the relationship, I was strangely reminded of Ned and Catelyn, and I wasn't expecting that. The other one, and this is the first thing that really jumped at me from this chapter, was Dany's horse.
Yeah.
Who's a gift from Khal Drogo. That's her big bride gift. And it reminded me so forcibly. I forgot this horse existed, but it reminded me so forcibly of Jon and Ghost.
Okay, yeah.
Because the horse is described and introduced as being gray as the winter sea with a mane like silver smoke.
Yeah, I liked that a lot.
And I think here we're getting to the prophetic just nature of Dany's chapters, zooming out, looking at them as checkpoints, looking at them maybe spiderwebbing across a bunch of other point of views in this book. I love that even from the very beginning, because we know, spoilers I guess, for everything that comes after this, we know that Jon and Dany end up being the two most important characters in this series.
Yeah.
Drawing those comparisons from the very beginning of the first book, I think, pays off dividends. And that comparison between Dany and her horse and Jon and Ghost, strengthening that connection from the first couple chapters of the opening novel, I think that really works for me. Tying these two principal characters together, inviting those ice and fire comparisons.
Yeah.
I got a lot out of that similarity here.
I do like that. And I also didn't remember the horse very much either. I remember that she gets a horse when they get married, but I don't remember anything about it beyond this chapter. So I'm curious to track it. And I wonder, like, do you think that we can think of Dany's horse, you know, like in the, like, is the horse to Dany what the direwolves are to the Stark children, and that like the direwolves are meant to be this sort of aspiration of what the Stark children want to be, or are they, you know, do they tell us what might happen to the Stark children? Like, are there fates in line? Do you think there's that much of a connection with Dany's horse?
It suggests that, and this is, I want to push a little further on this comparison, and I'm glad you're getting into that, because it suggests that the destinies of these characters, the narratives of these people's lives, are ramping up at the same moment, where we have the gift of dragon eggs and the discovery of direwolf pups at the same time. So there's a revitalization of these family symbols and sigils coming to life, and it feels like, okay, something's about to happen. If you're reading the history, you would write it this way.
Yeah.
So it would feel more inevitable.
Yeah.
But Dany and Jon, there's a lot, I feel like Jon's arc thus far is echoed in this Dany chapter. And there has to be an efficiency to these Dany chapters because they feel so much more occasional and remote than some of our other characters. We're going to get, 35 Ned chapters in this book and like 6 Dany's. So there's a density I want to sort of peel back in this Dany chapter. Dany and Jon are both entering new worlds and cultures. They're on the precipice of that, where she's going into the Dothraki world and he's about to go to the Wall. But also in the juxtaposition of having this right after a Jon chapter, he just paraded around Winterfell with Ghost saying goodbye. And now she's on her version of Ghost, parading around the Dothrakis saying hello. So there's that relay race. There's that symmetry between these characters where we watch them run in parallel and we see the Song of Ice and Fire with these symphonies playing simultaneously and complementing each other. I'm finding accents between how these characters are moving. And even Jon going to the Wall, that's not his choice.
Yeah, it's like his best choice out of the few that he has.
He's sort of being sold down the river because he doesn't know what he's giving. He doesn't fully understand. Benjen even says this to him. He doesn't fully understand what he's giving up.
Right.
It's not his future, his present is not really of his choosing.
Yeah.
And obviously that is doubled down on 100-fold in this chapter for Dany.
Right.
So they're both being entered into these new lifelong contracts via these vows.
Right.
We know Jon's going to take the vows at the Wall, and Dany has sort of the marriage vows here.
Yeah.
And they are both, they both, the thing that shapes them and directs them through these uncertain futures is their indirect noble lineage. Dany is the secondary Targaryen. She's the female, the passed over Targaryen.
Right.
And Jon is the bastard Stark.
Sure.
And her repeating...
/ secret Targaryen.
Well, that's where it really gets complicated. You start crossing streams. But her doing the blood of the dragon and him having this true... feels like the only true child of Ned Stark, the way we've gotten to know him so far.
Yeah.
He feels like the blood of the wolf, the dire wolf.
Yeah.
But also, of course, we know he's got some dragon in him, too.
Sure. Well, and they both, they end up making the absolute best of their situations and, claim a certain amount of agency and power within their like very limited powerless lives. You know, the way that Jon rises up in the ranks at the Wall, and the way that Dany, of course, seizes power over in the East. And this is actually really great, because the other moment of like prophetic foreshadowing that I saw is when she's riding the horse. And the line says, Dany found herself moving faster than she had intended, yet somehow it was exciting rather than terrifying. And I thought that felt to me very like descriptive and emblematic of what ends up happening for not the rest of her arc, but a good chunk of the rest of her story, right? Like this, like faster than she intended, but she like moves past it being terrifying and finds it very exciting, like to the point that it actually goes too fast and spirals out of control, at least when she finally arrives in Westeros, at least according to the show. So I like that it's while she's on that horse, which has this like prophetic, you know, destined quality to it, the way that Jon's direwolf and all the other Stark's direwolves do.
They're both also sort of defying the archetypes that we're trying to establish as we move further into the book. I was trying to look at Dany's cast of characters as we've sort of really met them all now. There'll be people who come in and out as she kind of globetrots through this world. But now that Jorah is really a part of the crew, we've got everyone. Obviously, we'll lose Viserys and Khal Drogo. But now that we have Jorah, I feel like we've got the whole crew.
We also got to name like her maidservants, or handmaids, excuse me, and then also some of the blood riders too. Like we got their names and stuff. So we're really setting all of that up.
And Jorah reminded me forcibly of Tyrion.
Oh.
Being this character, I mean, the last time we saw Tyrion, he was in the library reading Westerosi history.
Oh, that's
and
so
now
true.
Jorah is giving Dany books of Westerosi history.
That's great. I like that.
Also, the way Tyrion accompanies Jon on the journey to the Wall.
Yes, interesting.
Now we have Jorah accompanying Dany.
And like Jon and Tyrion have like the outcast gargoyle thing in common, and Dany and Jorah have the Westeros thing in common. That's awesome.
And like there is the gargoyle thing. I think you could call Jorah a gargoyle.
Yeah,
and
he's been exiled. Yeah,
because the other characters she's traveling with, like Viserys and Illyrio, they have much broader ambitions. I would say they are ineffective Lannisters.
Yes.
They are bad vultures.
Yes, very bad.
But what is Dany? Because she's smart. Every time someone is making a plan across the table from her, and we get that little jump in her brain of seeing how stupid that plan is.
Yeah, she's like, that's not going to work.
She's smart. She's clocking these things.
She's very smart.
She has some of the instincts of the gargoyle characters and some of the vultures. In the same way, Jon is taking little bits of Tyrion from that conversation and little bits from his father.
And he's just very observant and knows what's going on. Yeah.
But they both feel like pioneers. They both live in that gray area where they are becoming their own type of character. And I think they're going to become the same type of character.
Cool.
So I like watching these journeys in parallel.
Yeah.
The way this like musical chairs way of doing a fantasy story, of jumping between POVs so constantly, is really paying off for me. It just seemed like an interesting way of keeping it fresh for the first few weeks we were talking about the book.
Yeah.
But now, as we really get rooted in, finding those parallels, finding the echoes, the layers of connection, I'm really, I don't know, I feel like I'm digging my heels into this story now.
Yeah, I mean, it really invites those comparisons and connections, and also draws your attention to the deep contrast between all these characters too. Like, it's fun the way that we are in a very human way trying to categorize and like put these characters into different archetypes, but also still recognizing how much these characters push against archetypes because they're so human and complex. So it's fun to like recognize those things that make them a part of the gargoyle archetype or the vulture archetype, but also recognizing how different and distinct they all are too. So yeah, this is really fun.
Very rewarding chapter.
Very, yeah.
And I feel like now we are going into sort of book 2.
Agreed. Yeah, the next chapter is Ned, and I believe they're on the road in the next chapter. So we're going to get back to the Starks, and can't wait to see what Ned has to say. I don't remember what, like, these like first chapters I really remember, like, oh yeah, I remember the first Jon chapter, I remember that important Bran chapter, I remember this important Dany chapter. Going forward, I don't really remember what's what now. It's all jumbled to me. So this really does feel like a whole new section of the book going forward.
So what did you think of this chapter? Let us know in the YouTube comments or in the Patreon comments, or you can email us. All that information is in the episode description or bio.
Yes.
Thank you very much for joining us. We are brought to you, of course, by Patreon. We have 2 bonus episodes this month. I already mentioned that. Volume 5 of The Breakfast Buffet and Godzilla -1 minus color.
Yes.
So thank you for joining us. We'll be back on Tuesday with a brand new episode. Have a great weekend.
Bye.